Nice. Cool. So Lydia Jennings, our mentor, a revered educator. Um, this is the second year that you've joined us at Footprints, right?
Yes, it
Can you
is.
can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to what you're doing now, and as well as what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I guess my academic background is I'm an environmental scientist and now trained soil scientist. I earned my PhD at the University of Arizona. I study mining issues, mining reclamation, but also kind of tribal consultation of new mines, and how community, and specifically Indigenous community perspectives, are valued or not valued in that process. And then also mining reclamation. So that's kind of my general academic background. My personal background, I've been a runner most of my life. Um, I'm a citizen of the Pascua Yaquí tribe. I grew up in northern New Mexico, and I've been running throughout middle school, high school, and some college. So I think as I studied my academic pathways, it was a really natural braiding of experiences. It's like running has been part of what got me to college. And then in college, running was an important way of kind of taking care of myself, and decompressing from long days in the lab, but also building community around running. And so when I first heard about Footprints, is that enough, or should I keep going?
Keep going, or that's
Okay.
enough. Whatever you want to talk about is fine.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I started working a lot with the company Natives Outdoors, who's one of the sponsors of Footprints Running Camp. And through that, I think I got a lot of exposure to different outdoor companies and outdoor athletes. And so one of those was Claire Gallagher, and I think she's a friend of yours, Dakota.
Mhm.
And so she was one of the people who would be like, "Hey, this seems like a good merge of your interests." And I think connected Dakota and I. And so that's kind of how I've become engaged with Footprints. And I like love that we get to run in really beautiful places, but also talk about mining and talk about this big part of the US's economy and history and also our present, right? And so,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, having you at the camp is really cool because you understand the outdoor industry and like running culture, and you're also a soil scientist who understands a lot of environmental issues. You've specifically worked on some of like the land reclamation sites in the San Juans where we host the camp. You also have this indigenous perspective that is not something that I could personally share. And I guess, how do you manage like all these different like focuses you have, or really are they so different, right? Like this indigenous perspective and like focus that you have, and like tribal sovereignty, and then like working at soil science and land reclamation. Like how do you I guess juggle all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because so like I'm in the process of becoming a professor or working towards that.
Nice.
Um, and just like working in the academic spaces. And so for like me, and I often get this question of like, how do you have so many interests and like
Yeah.
merge them? But I think, and like now increasingly merge them. And I don't think that it's something necessarily set out to. It's kind of been organic capacities, and I think in a lot of ways by necessity. And I think increasingly, I think that's a really indigenous way of doing things, is that we don't really see those separations. We're all coexisting in ecosystems and spaces in different fields. And I think it's much more of a like Western or settler culture, like definitely Western science has, and which is what most of us are taught in school, is done through this like very siloed perspective. And increasingly we see more like transdisciplinary research. It's really common in Indigenous science to see more transdisciplinary, integrating different fields. But I think that's like also reflective of a very different like colonial mindset as well, of like separating everything. Whereas I think in a lot of ways, like Indigenous, you're part of an ecosystem, so you're not separate from it. So you're thinking about all these different ways that you experience that ecosystem. And so I think that applies a lot to my research, but also how I live my life. So running has been a big part of what informed me to become a scientist and help support my educational pathways, but also like my own mental health. And so it's been interesting, and I think a little bit different when I started using my social media presence to kind of talk about both my science and running and how they co-inform one another, that I think I got a fair amount of attention, because that wasn't typically how most people in the running industry talk about their experiences. you know, I look at a lot of the people who I've traditionally seen, and it's talking about, you know, their fastest known times or going the longest or the fastest. And that's a different type of enjoyment in running spaces. That's not necessarily mine. I mean, I like to try it sometimes too, but I think I have a little bit of a different experience. And I don't think, you know, an important part of running is that all of those experiences are equally valid. There's not one that we should necessarily emphasize above another, because everyone has different ways of engaging in those spaces, and we can all learn from one another. Like, I love learning about you, Dakota, and how like your nutrition that you're thinking about and your training, you're learning about the different places that you're going, right? That's a different type of training than like I'm thinking about. But maybe I can incorporate bits and pieces of that into my own training regimes to try to become faster, if that's what I'm looking for. And so I think in the same way, I'm hoping that you're learning from me about how I'm looking at the soils and thinking about the history of the places that I'm running with, and even like running with and not running on, right? And like those kinds of language shifts. And that's how we can learn from one another in a community. And so I think that's part of the strength of Footprints running, is that we are all kind of there in a community with very different lived experiences, very different reasons why we run. And the big point of that is being able to merge multiple parts of our identity and passions into a bigger practice overall.
Totally. Yeah, that's amazing. You know, you see a lot of like in Western, I guess, colonial like science, you get it's all about like reductionism, right? Like getting it down to like the basic building blocks so you can understand them. And it definitely seems like a lot of academics that I know these days who I've been able to meet through Footprints are trying to do more of what you're doing, where they're like putting the pieces together and looking at things from like a more ecosystem level and seeing how they interact rather than separating all the pieces. And I think that that's a good metaphor for both for like just like cooperating in the world too, and like talking about climate action. It's not like you have like, well, climate scientist is going to save the world, or the lawyer who's going to save the world, or a business person. It's like everybody has to be a part of this, right?
Yeah. And I think that really comes, like, at least in my own opinions and my frame about it, is like, I look at a lot of our traditional communities, and like we all had to coexist together. And it's like some people were better, you know, foragers, some people were better hunters, some people were really good at like being fire tenders, but like we all had a role in a community. And I think in a lot of ways, the way that our dominant society has kind of siloed everyone, and that you have to be everything at once, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And I think that's like what we have a lot of ripple effects of that happening right now. And so I think kind of remembering that we all have different roles, and I think a lot about it in like the work that I do. And when I talk to youth, and it's like, okay, you love to do art and you like to write, and like I like to do science, and none of those are better than the other. It's just all different skill sets that we bring to these bigger issues, but we need all those different skill sets to address these challenges, because none of us can do it alone, and none of us can do it through one way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, at Footprints, we started with this idea of like having all these scientists come and teach climate science. And now we've really branched out to include a lot of people who are like doing business, or even like professional athletes, like basically anybody who can like address climate by bringing people together. But well, for one, I feel like you actually do both these things. Like you're very like community oriented and a scientist, but I think it'd be kind of cool to hear about like your work as a scientist, specifically with soil, because until I like basically met you and Moira, another one of our mentors, I didn't quite realize how important soil is to climate health and carbon, and it's a major carbon reservoir. And so could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I love about soils is beyond like air and water, you're going to interact with them everywhere, right? In many different types of forms. And like people, each soil is so unique. They're shaped by the experiences of the parent material, the rock, the geology. They're shaped by the climate. They're shaped by the time periods and all the different like biological factors that are affecting them. And so I really think in a lot of ways, soils are like us, and they're incredibly unique to those lived experiences. Then they're not lived, but they are in many ways that lived.
Some of them are living. Crypto's living.
Yeah, crypto's living, but I mean also like all the biotic factors that are shaping them, those are all living. And so I kind of like say that with hesitation, because for many people, they don't see them as living, but as a soil scientist, I definitely see them living. And so I bring all that background of how different soils are, because so are the people who study soils, right? And so you have someone like Moyer who's studying like permafrost soils, which is very different than the type of soil science that I do. And so I study soils that have been really degraded by mining. And like there's a very often common debate in soil science of like, are those really soils? Or like some people call them technosols, which are like, they're not really soils, but like we don't have a better category for them. Some people call them substrate. And so even those can be like very complicated, but overall you still use the same techniques and theories to be able to study them and figure out how do we bring life into them? How can we heal them? Are they healable, right? How do we help make them part of a landscape again? And so in some ways it's kind of like I don't want to use this, I can't think of a better analogy right now, but kind of like reformation of an ecosystem. Like we do it with people through therapy and whatever other types of actions.
Yeah, totally.
I think like the same thing, it's like we're doing a kind of therapy with soils to help heal them and make them part of a community, part of an ecosystem again. And so, you know, my work is like looking at the most contaminated sick places, measuring them, measuring all their different types of properties, and then understanding them. And again, they are very complicated. They're not each soil is alike. And so like studying mining in the Sonoran Desert is so different than studying mining in the San Juan Mountains. But I think that's also why I like them, is that they're complex.
Yeah.
And they have really important roles to helping keep our community healthy. And so, you know, there's been really interesting work now that's looking at as climate change is happening, we're really losing, and our soils are increasingly becoming more and more degraded. So what does that mean for food futures? What does that mean for our outdoor recreation futures? What does that mean for our just like building our home infrastructure futures? Like those are a lot of them really important questions, and really why I think if anyone's studying climate issues, they should be thinking about the soils as much as any other factor.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And so on the kind of the other end of your perspective, you know, when we talk about climate change, there's also this like social justice component. Climate and social justice are often kind of just two sides of the same issue, right? And it seems like there's not a coincidence that the European American cultures that worked really hard to destroy the indigenous cultures are now basically causing this like global ecological breakdown, even though that when the indigenous cultures were the ones that like stewarded the land pretty healthily for many millennia. How can we like utilize indigenous perspectives in history and culture in order to like, I guess, do what's right for people and do what's right for the planet? Is that the right question? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like hard because there's multiple facets, right? Like
Totally.
I have some Native community members who are like, why should we share our knowledge and expertise when like, you know, you literally made all these laws to outlaw us from having access to our homelands and to our additional foods and medicines. And like, why should we do that? Why should we share that and like save us, save you, you know? But I think a bigger piece is like how we talk about science, how we think about our knowledge, how we reflect on those histories, and how we do better into the future. And so part of that is, you know, being able to be more expansive in what we think about as science, what we think about as stewardship, what we think about our relationships and how we engage in those spaces. Sometimes that might mean that like some tribal nations are telling you don't go to this place, and it's not because they're like necessarily trying to be restrictive, but because they're thinking about these long-term stewardship patterns that they've been seeing in the place, and like why we have to respect that, right? But I think that there are a lot of really important native knowledges, like traditional fire burning practices, like different water treatment systems, like even traditional growing practices. Like everyone talks today about regenerative agriculture, but that's really based off of indigenous knowledge. It is an indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
You know, about low intensity agricultural growing practices. And so I think there are a lot of those ways, one that like recognizing how certain native knowledge has been co-opted. I think the other part is recognizing how so many native knowledges and science practices are based in a place and in a community. And so it's important to learn from them, but like recognize that they can't always be globalized to other places either. And that's why I often think about with running, I love knowing my local home base area, my local watersheds. And I liked when I go somewhere new to learn about the tribes there and like their knowledges about those homelands and how I can be better respectful and learn from those places. That it has to be a whole process of like building that relationship with an ecosystem that we go and visit and engage with. And so I know this is like much more broad than like the question that you're asking for, but I think those are the first steps to thinking about the social justice pieces, and also our personal step within those social justice pieces. Outside of that, I think, you made a great point of, but social justice and environmental justice I think are one and the same. And so how are certain communities being excluded? How are they excluded both in their knowledges and their representation and their access? All of those are really important pieces. Because if people don't have access, then I think we continue to see some degradation that's happening when they begin to get access. How do we ensure we have education that's done in a culturally appropriate manner and capacity? How do we reflect on how we're interacting with one another in outdoor spaces too? I think that's a really important piece. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. You're right. It's a big question. It's the sort of thing we could talk about for a long time, but I really appreciate you sharing that. So to talk about footprints, can you tell us a bit about like your experience last year at the camp and like what you did and working with your camper Abby, that stuff?
Yeah. To be honest, last year I didn't know what to expect. It was like, I'm going in and we're just going to see what happens.
I didn't either, honestly.
But I would say like overall what I got was some really fun runs in beautiful places, some really great friendships, and a lot of really great thinking that applies not only to the student projects, but also like reflective for myself as an educator, and how do we talk about hard subjects. Mm-hmm. I'm mining, and I feel like it's pretty straightforward, and I like to challenge people to think about mining in a contemporary capacity, especially as everyone's pushing for renewable energies and sustainable technologies. And I often like to ask the question of sustainable for who? And I think that there were really great questions, like our conversations from Moira about climate resiliency. There is really great presentation from Pete about sustainability in food systems. So many great things that I learned out as both a mentor, but then learning from my mentees and their experiences. And so my mentee was Abby, and she, I think, was unique in that she came in with a really crystallized idea of what the projects that she wanted to address, and kind of the steps and actions that she needed to do to address that, and kind of left with a plan of action. But we helped really distill that plan of action better. And a big piece that ended up coming out was just like how you communicate the action that she wants to do. How do you communicate it and get people to care about it? And she had on the basic level of like wanting to make sure she had information to talk to her city council and different community organizations, but on a bigger level, she wanted to create like a race event to address cyanobacteria that are partially caused from fertilizers getting into her local lake. So I think that was a really great example, but it was so fun to learn and engage with other people's projects in relation to, they may have started with one idea and completely changed it. And it was really cool to see the growth over a week and how much their ideas and thinkings can change as a result of just having mentors and about talking about those projects more in depth. And so I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I left really hopeful is it's amazing how in a week, how much we can grow and learn and think about the positive change we want to make in our community and what could happen if we were thinking about this in a more consistent basis.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, is that we have this really great opportunity to have all these amazing people come to the camp. We spend a week together running and like working on these really cool projects. But then we go home and we're kind of out of that situation. And it's sometimes hard to like carry that momentum forward because you're back in your own normal space and your normal habits. It's also like, how can people who aren't able to come to the camp like develop these kind of projects? Are there like resources? Are there habits? Like what do you think are ways that people who are curious about taking action on climate but just don't know what to do, like where do you even start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think, Dakota, you're developing a reading list, right? There's a couple of different books, which I'll let you recommend.
It's not really a plug, but we are trying to develop those resources so you come to us.
Well, go ahead, give you that time to plug that and maybe put it in the show notes here.
Yeah.
But I also think, part of it is like expanding what you're exposed to and who you're exposed to. And so maybe you don't have a group of footprints runners who are working on a concrete project, but I do think exposing yourself to a variety of people who are thinking around climate and using their passions in a variety of sources, whether that's like different podcasts or in your local running community, and thinking about how you can get involved more. There's so many running communities that have trail stewards, or mountain biking communities, I think, are a little bit better developed, but have trail stewards and how you can build trails and start to learn about the different issues that might be working in your community. And I think getting those kinds of ideas and also ideas on where you can get potentially funding or the kind of mentorship that you might need are really important. I think mentorship is a big one. And so I think those are a couple of getting exposure to different people, getting mentorship, and also looking at the different types of resources, both intellectual and financial, to help support your projects.
Yeah. It seems like you've done a bunch of different things all over the place, but it seems like you're always coming back to like educating and kind of empowering other people. Like you said, you're trying to become a professor, or applying. I don't know, trying to be sounds like you're not.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm in the process of it. I'm working towards that right now. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And I'm curious, like, how did you end up, it seems like you want to be an educator just from different perspectives. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like talking with people, and I think like being an educator is like I'm being an educator, but I'm being educated in the same process, right? And so for
Well,
me,
isn't that how all the best educators go into it, right?
right, right. And it's like sometimes I get questions from students that I'm like, dang, I don't know the answer to that. But like I think together we're trying to create a different world, right?
Yeah.
And part of that is just like awareness. I think about how many people have just maybe never had exposure outside of their community, and that's okay. But when you do get an opportunity to go somewhere different, it makes you reflect on home so much more differently and appreciate things about it, and also recognize things that maybe you wish you could change, right? And probably because I'm an educator, I think education is a really important piece of all of this. But so are having those different experiences that get you out of your comfort zone. And at the end of the day, like for me, a lot of this has come from, my whole like pathway to science communication came because I had so many people who were like, Lydia, you're in the lab all the time. What are you doing there? And so I'd be like, okay, well, like, let me post on Instagram so my mom knows what I'm doing, and then it's people or community members be like, why are you doing that process? And that's like really how all of this started, was just like posting on Instagram and getting questions and learning like, oh, if I can't explain it to them, I probably can't explain it in a paper very well.
Yeah.
Or like, let me think about all these complex things and break them down easier. Because if I don't know, and now that process, I'm trying to break it down easier, I realized the things I didn't know that I needed to figure out. And so I think it's education for others, but education for yourself that kind of help everyone see a bigger picture. And I think that's really beautiful.
Nice. You must have had some pretty good mentors yourself, haven't you?
I definitely have, and at different stages of my life, and mentorship in a variety of different ways. I think mentorship is one of the most important skills, whether it's academic or running. I think about the mentors I've had in running who are like, Lydia, you should really like build in some more speed work, or like, what are you doing for nutrition? And I'm like, I don't know, like, what am I supposed to do? Right.
Yeah.
That have helped me get through like my graduation 50 miler, some of my biggest adventures and best performances as a runner have become as a result of people who've mentored me. And so I see kind of these parallel pathways between academic spaces and running spaces, because both of them can be sometimes very elite and exclusionary, but there are so many people who are trying to pull more of us in and make it a more inviting space. And I think those are the people I want to be surrounded by, and I want to grow into the future.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. Like it seems like there's, in trail running, it's a competitive thing for sure, but it's definitely less competitive, I think, than other forms of running or other sports. And like that community aspect is a major motivator for a lot of us. And so, it's like I like competing, but the best thing that I've ever gotten out of trail running is footprints, which is not competitive at all.
And I think too, like, maybe this is just like as you get older, you recognize like, I'm not going to be the person who can do all these things. I'm like, I want to support other people who can, because I also just want to enjoy life, right? I want to like not have to hustle all the time and be able to like sit at the sidelines and cheer for someone else who's put in the hard work.
Totally.
I think there's a really beautiful piece of that. And so I think like there's so many, when you're younger, you have so much endless energy to put towards things. And now as I'm getting older, I'm like, I need to sleep a lot more. So how can I help other people like put all that energy towards really productive things so I can sleep more?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it seems like you're already trying to work on that. I mean, you went out with the Wings for America crew out to the Boston Marathon this year, right?
Yeah. It was really great. We got to take 6 high school students who are amazing runners. They ran the Boston 5K. They all placed in the top 10 of their age, but also take them to see a city like Boston, and many of them are from Southwest reservations.
Yeah.
Get to like explore and visit, all these institutions. I think I provided a unique perspective because I'm both an academic and a runner, and kind of
Yeah.
navigate these dual spaces.
And you've lived
I
all over
took
the world.
yeah. And so we got to go to visit Harvard, Northwestern, MIT, and like it was just really cool to see their reactions and look think about these different places, help them ask questions about like their applications, but like what kind of resources and support those places might have for them. So I think that part was really beautiful. But then also to see them shine at the Boston 5K and like just such incredible athletes. And I think myself and the other mentor, Verna, who runs Native Women Running, kind of talking about the role that running has played in our lives outside of, these athletic careers that are like collegiate athletic careers, right? Like I ran my first year of college and I got injured and that was great. But like,
Great.
running is still part of my life today in ways that I didn't think it would be. And so there's also those pathways for students that you can be multiple things at once. You don't have to just be an outstanding runner. You can also have other parts of your life that fulfill you.